Welcome back. In the last session, we considered how the bigger picture of a biblical worldview enables us to see plants and math in ways that no other worldview can afford. The biblical worldview of God, creation, humanity, moral order, and purpose provides a truly extraordinary meaning, not only to plants and numbers, but to everything else as well. That is, if teachers can pull back the veil once in a while at least, and students can freely converse about these things. But in a secularized culture like the present in America, this isn't the norm. It's a lost art. Yet it can become the norm in schools that train teachers and students to think holistically about all things, similar to the way that Comenius and the other integrationists did in the initial wave of the Reformation. In this session, I'd like to focus on how the bigger picture of a biblical worldview enables us to engage with painting, sculpture, and cinema in biblically integrative ways. Have you ever considered how a person's concept of the bigger picture can affect one's approach to pottery making? Probably you haven't thought much about that unless you're a potter yourself. But think about it. What difference would a person's worldview make when it comes to working with clay? Well, we've seen some examples of how a person's worldview affects the way he or she sees plants and interacts with them. There's no question Carver's holistic biblical worldview really affected the way he interacted with plants. And there's no question the animistic worldview of the group of animists we saw in the North Carolina woods affects the way they interact with trees and rocks. Well, the same principle is at work when it comes to interacting with sound and color and clay. Now, just to give you one example, I'd like you to take a brief look at how an animistic worldview can affect one's approach to pottery making.
This matter that's extremely silky and soft, it becomes a part of you. You never are disrespectful to the clay in any way. When you begin working and making a pot, it forms itself. And when the pot is ready to close, then it comes together. And when it's finished, it's finished. But it's impossible to try and make a pot be something that it doesn't want to be. Pottery making is our connection to the earth.
Now, in thinking how a person's worldview affects one's approach to the arts, I'd like to take a few moments to talk about how dualism affects the way many Christians think about the arts. Bear in mind that dualism is what Comenius and the integrationists of the Pan-Sophic movement were working against. Two schools of thought were at odds with each other during the first wave of the Reformation. There was the holistic view of Comenius and the integrationists, and then there was the dualistic view of Descartes, who sought to separate the metaphysical from the physical, and to separate theology from the world of matter. How has dualism and the sacred-secular divide affected Christians' thinking in the area of the arts today? Well, we often hear the term secular music applied to the kind of music we don't hear in church. The term secular art is applied to the kind of paintings that hang on the office wall that don't include an angel or a cross on the canvas. But what exactly makes art or music secular? Now, I hope you're a bit perplexed at me for even framing the question this way, because framing the question this way really presupposes there is such a thing as the secular world. But as I shared in session 3 and 4, this concept itself is a faulty premise. From a biblical frame of reference, there's really no secular realm at all. If Jesus is Lord of all, he's Lord of all color. He's Lord of all oil paint. He's Lord of all sound vibrations. And he's Lord of all clay. He's holding it all together by the word of his power. And without him, there is not anything made that was made, not anything that exists that does exist. And this certainly includes all raw materials that go into any work of art. Now, the word secular implies some sort of separation of God from his creation. It implies some kind of gap between God and his stuff. Now, Comenius and the integrationists did not recognize any gap. For them, real education was a matter of seeing things in the context of the bigger, real whole of a biblical worldview. But in a secularized culture, the gap is really considered normative. And as I mentioned before, Descartes won the debate. Today, dualism is taken for granted, even, I'm sorry to say, among many well-meaning Christians. But since it is not possible to divorce God from his stuff, we have to think differently about everything, and that includes art. There's no neutral ground if by the word secular we mean to imply a sort of neutral space. That space just isn't there. Now, am I saying there's no such thing as secular art? Am I saying that all art is sacred? Well, here again, the very term sacred and secular, these terms are confusing. They're not helpful. They presuppose a gap that really isn't there, and we need to use a totally different paradigm. It's a way of seeing that doesn't divide things into upper and lower categories. It doesn't compartmentalize some things as God's things or sacred things and other things as neutral things or man's things. It's a way of seeing that views all things as God's things. For without him, as I said, nothing would exist that exists, whether it's a thing in heaven or a thing on earth. Whether it's a temporal thing or an eternal thing. It's all his stuff. Deuteronomy 10:14 reminds us that heaven and the highest heavens belong to the Lord. Also, the earth with all that is in it. Colossians 1:16 and 17 says, "For by him," and if you look carefully at the context here, it's referring to Christ, "For by Christ all things were created that are in heaven and that are on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or principalities or powers. All things were created through him and for him. And he is before all things, and in him all things consist or hold together." I haven't seen a secular color. Have you? There's no secular clay. There's no secular sound wave. But you may still be asking, what about the bad art around us? What about the ugly art? What about the destructive types of art that we sometimes see? Well, this is where the harsh realities of a fallen world come in. We know from Genesis 1 through 3 and Romans 1 through 8 and other portions of Scripture that God's good stuff has been negatively affected, negatively impacted by sin, human independence and pride. And as a consequence of that sin, we now live in a broken world. It's not the way God originally made it to be. The whole earth is suffering. God's good stuff can be distorted. It can be misused. It can be misshapen and abused. But it's still God's stuff. That's the tragedy of the fall. The same batch of clay that owes its very existence to Christ, being held together through time by him, can be used to form art that's honoring to the Lord or an abomination to him. And in either case, the stuff it's made from is his. Jesus is Lord of every piece of clay and every chunk of marble on the planet. So instead of thinking in terms of sacred things in a contrived upper sphere and secular things in a contrived lower sphere, we have to think of all things as his things, and we can think of ourselves and others as either aligning those things with him and his purposes and his will, or aligning them against him. Good art, I would suggest, is art that is aligned with God, is aligned with his nature and character, is aligned with his purposes. But a painting doesn't have to be a painting of the Last Supper to fit this qualification. It doesn't need to include a white dove or a cross to qualify it. Yes, it can include that, but it doesn't have to. Can we really call this art secular art? On what basis? It seems to be in alignment with his character and reflective of his creation. And by the way, lots of art that's in alignment with the character of God is created by human beings who are not Christians. Well, that's because all truth is God's truth, all goodness is God's goodness, and all beauty is God's beauty. And all people, whether they're Christians or not, are created in the likeness and image of a creative God. And he has created people in his likeness and image as creators on a small scale, whether they acknowledge the Lord or not. They are by nature creators. I was interested one day to see a documentary about the making of the film Chariots of Fire. What really interested me was that it was very evident from this documentary that this film was not created as a so-called Christian film. Yet the film really glorifies God in many ways. This isn't to say that a film that's in alignment with the character of God needs to have a happy ending. It doesn't have to. Not all Bible stories have happy endings either. Truth is sometimes hard to look at. It's painful sometimes. And art may depict painful things at times. But to glorify darkness, that's a whole nother matter. As the prophet Isaiah put it, woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness, who put bitter for sweet and sweet bitter. But as we evaluate art, we can ask, does it align in some way with the character of God? Is it in some way reflective of his will, his purposes? Is it some way reflective of the ultimate artist? Well, these are the kinds of questions worth asking. Now, all of us are touched by art on a daily basis, whether it's in the form of music or graphic design or fine arts. A world without art would be a very dreary place. In the context of art education, we can help eliminate the sacred-secular divide. We can help eliminate the gap and remove the dualistic Cartesian split from the thinking of Christians. And the best way to get rid of this split, in my opinion, is to replace it with a different way of seeing. No color is secular. It's all God's possession, and he's sustaining every sound wave that comes from every musical instrument invented. Yes, the raw materials are his, but what human beings do with his stuff is quite another thing. Sometimes what people do with God's raw stuff is really deplorable. Sometimes it's honorable to God, whether the people that shape it are fully cognizant of that or not. Well, many times it's a mixture of both honorable and dishonorable things. Well, the scripture is clear that God cares about beauty. And because we are created in his likeness and his image, we care about beauty too. People enjoy beautiful art. We're affected by it, and God knows that. He's wired us that way. It's interesting to me to note in Genesis chapter 2, verse 9, where it talks about God's creation of trees. It says that God didn't just create trees for utilitarian purposes, for human food alone, but also for human enjoyment as a visual source of pleasure. It says, "And out of the ground the Lord God made every tree to grow that is pleasant to the sight and good for food." That's very interesting. Here we see God creates trees with an aesthetic dimension, and he does that intentionally, designing them in such a way that they're pleasant for human beings to view. He didn't have to do this, but he did. And I think there's a lesson for us here. I think it's very godlike to create works in such a way that there's aesthetic value. We don't have to hang a beautiful painting on a wall. We don't have to put a fountain in the entry of an office, but it sure can be pleasant to the senses for all who enter. In Exodus 28:2, we read that God instructed Moses to make garments for Aaron. And he said he wanted to have them made for glory and for beauty. Now, these robes were not just functional. Yes, they were functional, but they were also pleasing to the sight. In verse 31 to 34 of that same chapter, we're given even more detail. It says, "You shall make the robe of the ephod all of blue. It shall have a woven binding all around its opening, and upon its hem you shall make pomegranates of blue, purple, and scarlet, all around its hem, and bells of gold between them all around. A golden bell and a pomegranate, a golden bell and a pomegranate upon the hem of the robe all around." Well, think about it. Blue pomegranates? Have you ever seen blue pomegranates? I haven't. But the Lord instructed people to sow blue pomegranates next to purple and scarlet ones for the sake of beauty. In the chapter of Exodus where God prescribes blue pomegranates for Aaron's robe, he also says to Moses, "So you shall speak to all who are gifted artisans, whom I have filled with the spirit of wisdom, that they may make Aaron's garments." Now, what's noteworthy here is the fact that God filled artisans with the spirit of wisdom for the task of designing clothing. Now, that's a different sort of wisdom than usually comes to mind when we hear the word wisdom. We usually think about words of wisdom or wise counsel, but here we see another sort of wisdom, wise clothing design. In Exodus 31, 2 through 4, God says, "See, I have called by name Bezalel, the son of Uri, the son of Hur, of the tribe of Judah, and I have filled him with the Spirit of God, in wisdom, in understanding, in knowledge, and in all manner of workmanship, to design artistic works, to work in gold and silver and bronze, in cutting jewels for setting, in carving wood, and to work in all manner of workmanship." All manner of workmanship? Does wisdom apply to artwork and craftsmanship? Yes, it does. What's so interesting about Exodus 31, 2 through 4 is the fact that this is the first recorded instance in the Bible of a human being being filled with the Spirit. But for what purpose? To preach? To prophesy? No, for craftsmanship. Have you ever heard of someone being prayed over to be filled with the Holy Spirit so he or she could produce good art or excellent craftsmanship? Could this be part of an art class at a Christian school? In holistic education, it can be. I think it should be, and it should certainly be a part of our church experience as well. Now we're bringing the matter of craftsmanship, all kinds of craftsmanship, including art as well as woodworking and metalworking, into the context of a much bigger picture that goes beyond wood and metal and art itself. It's the bigger picture that brings extraordinary meaning to all kinds of art and craftsmanship. Wouldn't it be something if artists and musicians and filmmakers in the body of Christ were to be commissioned by their local churches to produce excellent artwork? Now, I'm not talking about churches having people do artwork to hang on the sanctuary wall necessarily, although that would be appropriate too. But I'm talking about setting artists apart, sanctifying them, as the scripture would say, to be filled with the Spirit for the purposes of God to be accomplished through their artwork in the world. And doing this with as much seriousness as we would pray for the next missionaries flying to Haiti. Wouldn't it be great if television and film producers were commissioned by their local churches to produce excellent TV programs and film? I admire the late Mr. Rogers. Now, if you're taking this distance learning course from somewhere outside of North America, I have to explain a little bit about who Mr. Rogers was. During his lifetime, Fred Rogers devoted himself to the production of a daily half-hour television program for kids called Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. And in his daily program, Mr. Rogers talked with his young television audience in a way that was kind, it was informative, it was creative, it was engaging, and it was very original. At times he dealt with painful and difficult topics such as loneliness and anger or parents getting a divorce. But Mr. Rogers was never preachy. He touched on real-life issues that children commonly encounter, and he incorporated make-believe into the program with an extraordinary balance and really good taste that produced something worth watching. What many do not know is that Mr. Rogers was an ordained Presbyterian minister and was actually commissioned by the Presbyterian Church to do his television work with children. One writer, David Hiskey, relates that when Fred Rogers saw a television program, quote, that had something horrible on it with people throwing pies at one another, Rogers decided to try to work within the industry to help develop quality programs. Fred Rogers said, "I went into television because I hated it so, and I thought that there was some way of using this fabulous instrument to be of nurture to those who would watch and listen." Well, that's pretty interesting. I went into television because I hated it so. Well, if you've never seen a Mr. Rogers program, you can go onto YouTube and just type in Mr. Rogers Neighborhood full episode, and you'll find a number of his programs there. I encourage you to watch one. And then I urge you to watch a short video clip of Rogers appearing before the United States Senate in 1969. This little clip will give you some insight into Mr. Rogers' philosophy of entertainment. The link to that YouTube clip is on the screen. My great-grandmother was a committed follower of Christ, and according to my mother, my great-grandmother called the radio the devil's black box. My great-grandmother was alive when the radio was invented, and she, along with many other Christians apparently, felt that the radio would be used to further the domain of darkness. Well, at times, the radio has been used in that way. But it is God who created and sustains all radio waves Whether his waves are used in an honorable or a dishonorable way will be determined by what human beings put on them. We were created and commissioned in the beginning to rule over radio waves. Television waves are included in that realm of human rulership. Mr. Rogers ruled over television waves well. What is broadcast on God's radio or television waves or the internet? It can either be in line with the domain of darkness or in line with the kingdom of light. We need Christ followers who are bringing radio, TV, and internet into harmony with the nature and character of God. I think by and large, Fred Rogers did that pretty well. Well, regrettably, since the days of my great-grandmother, many Christians have distanced themselves from careers in radio, television, and film, thinking that they would be selling out spiritually if they went to work in those fields. Well, I'm sure many have sold out, but not all. Phil Cook is a producer and a director in the television and film industry today who is a follower of Christ. I called him up one day and interviewed him over the phone, and I'd like you to hear a few of his comments now.
There are an enormous number of Christians in Hollywood right now, but we need more. Most of the Christians that are here, we view ourselves not as Christian filmmakers. We view ourselves as Christians who happen to be filmmakers. And so hopefully in the films that we make or the television programs that we create, that message will seep through because of who we are and what our lives are all about. Well, I know some guys that believe that it's not a Christian film unless Christ is in it. But, you know, like you say, there's not a Christian color, but when it comes to filmmakers or television producers, we expect them to have a altar call at the end of their film, or it's not a Christian thing. I'm kind of tired of Christians who come to Hollywood and are second-rate screenwriters, third-rate directors. They expect a pass because they're believers. We need to be really good at what we do first. I always tell my producers and writers and directors that whatever show you create has to be a really, really good show first. So my point is we've got to be better storytellers. We have to be better filmmakers, directors, writers, producers. The biggest things Christians need to do is understand the power of the media. The average American family now is watching TV and surfing the web 5.5 hours a day. By the time a teenager is 18 years old, they've seen over 100,000 beer commercials alone on television. Who's influencing people today? A pastor may preach or teach in his church for 1 hour a week, at the most 2, on the outset 3, but they're listening to the media 5 and 6 hours a day. Who's going to have the most influence in their lives? So Christians need to understand that if we don't figure this thing out, if we don't understand the media, understand how to use it more effectively, I believe we'll lose a generation because that's the primary influence in people's lives today.
Well, we do need to come to grips with the fact that television, and even more so the internet, has more significant influence on most young people than pastors do. Some producers of TV and film claim that their shows don't influence people's behavior, but Bill Cosby really had it right when he said, "The networks say they don't influence anybody." Well, if that's true, why do they have commercials? Well, I suspect that if a large number of followers of Christ had been commissioned by their local churches years ago to create wise works of art in the arena of television and film, maybe the industry wouldn't be quite the field of nightmares it is today. Well, I'd like to conclude this session with a conversation that I had with a high school drama instructor who currently works at a Christian school near where I live, and his name is Mark Ramquist. Let's listen. Well, I'm just really excited to interview Mark here because I wanted to get his read on drama and education and find out what he's doing here at the school. And so I'm going to just pepper him with a few questions here. Are you ready, Mark?
Fire
you
away.
ready to get peppered?
Fire away.
Okay. Well, Mark, tell us a little bit about yourself, a bit about your background, particularly as it relates to drama and in your own faith journey. I know you spent some time in Japan. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about that, but just kind of give us a feel for who you are.
I grew up in a Christian home, became a believer when I was a child, basically. And as you can see, I'm a product of the 60s and 50s, and there wasn't a whole lot of drama in our church, our activities, more music, that sort of thing. So I didn't have a whole lot of opportunity to be involved in drama myself as I was growing up. But it was down deep inside, latent, and I wanted to be involved somehow. I knew I was full of expression of God's love, kind of the incarnational sense of what God's love could be as it was expressed. Originally, for me, through a lot of music, and that's what took us to Japan. We were involved in music ministry there for 20 years. The latter part of that, though, I had a chance to be doing some drama productions for our local church there and some citywide activities, and I got to be the drama coordinator at a missionary kids school where our children were, and realized there it was starting to come out and having opportunity to express faith, love through drama in that way. And then we transitioned back to the Pacific Northwest and got involved in community theater and doing some writing as well as backstage work and directing. And then the opportunity came open to come here and be the theater director here at this school.
Just a couple questions about what you just told me. What is it about drama that makes it a particularly good vehicle for expression of the things of God?
Story is a very powerful way to present truth so that an audience who might be resistant to an overt presentation can receive it and be highly impacted. A great biblical example is when Nathan, the prophet, came to David and gave him the parable about the man who stole the sheep and that sort of thing. David says, oh, he got the story right away. He says, that should never happen.
It upset him, didn't it?
Yeah. Nathan said, you're the man. And that kind of impact, I think, can happen as we put truth and redemptive stories on stage. The audience goes, ooh, yeah, that's it. That's me. So I think there's very powerful impact.
It's interesting, too, that Jesus, in a lot of his teaching, taught through stories, didn't he? He didn't do a lot of what we would call typical hermeneutic sermonizing.
Very little. And I think our Western society, our sense of presentation in the last 100 years has gotten away from storytelling or presenting truth through story. So we have 3 points in a poem, and that's the way we present things. But I think, especially in a postmodern world like we live in, story is a great way to get past the defenses. And people understand they're impacted a little more.
It's interesting because people don't ever seem to get tired of hearing stories. I mean, here we are in the 21st century, and stories are big. Huge.
If we hadn't had movies, I think the stage would be even bigger than it is now. But look at Broadway and London and other places where a story presented on stage, especially with music, is a huge draw. Right? And movies, for example, of course, that's story. Just presented on a screen instead of on a stage.
In Darrell Miller's book, Life Work, he says the arts are perhaps the most powerful tool for shaping culture. Musicians, filmmakers, poets, and writers are at the cutting edge of cultural formation. And then in another part of his book, he quotes Plato, where Plato said, "Give me the songs of a nation, and it matters not who writes its laws." Do you have any thoughts about those statements?
I had that statement on my wall in Japan when we were doing music ministry.
The Plato statement?
Yeah.
Oh.
Give me the music of a nation. I don't care who writes the laws.
Yeah.
I'll control the people.
What does that mean to you?
I
How did it
think-
apply to
yeah.
you in Japan?
I think it has a lot to do with putting values into people's thinking
Ah,
through their songs and through the words that they're singing, and it helps shape the way people think.
shapes their worldview.
That's a good word.
Well, you have to define it, but it can work sometimes, yeah.
Frankly, I think one of the strongest ways to think about it is our world today, I think, is highly shaped by television,
Yeah.
by TV commercials.
Oh, yeah.
I see values expressed in the high school students that I work with that come out of a couple specific TV shows I could name that are anything but a godly worldview.
Yeah.
That subconsciously, I think, this generation has watched and has adopted those values.
Well, Mark, as the drama director of a Christian school, I'm sure you must have some guidelines in your head as to what helps you to determine what plays or musicals would be worth the time and effort and money to actually produce here in a Christian school. What are some of those guidelines?
And of course, there's a lot depending on the size of the cast and that sort of thing. But what I'm looking for are presentations that have a great story, a strong protagonist with a strong antagonist, and how their conflict shapes the story and how the story moves forward. For our audience and for our students, it needs to be really relevant, and so that's the second one. I want it to be really relevant. There's some great stories out there that not relevant to high school kids. And so I'd love to do it, but probably we wouldn't do it here. There's other ones that are more relevant. And not to be too alliterative, I love stories that have some sort of a redemptive element to it. I was just at a show downtown, and it's very, very popular. But we looked at each other and said, there's nothing redemptive in this story at all. And we decided, well, we probably won't ever do that one here.
Can you give me an example of a redemptive theme in a play that you might do?
Wow. I think a prime example is Les Miserables.
Yes.
It was done here a number of years ago, full of law and grace and mercy and self-sacrifice. It's amazing.
It is
The
an
themes that are
amazing
woven
story.
in there, and hugely popular
Yeah.
these days. Been around 25 years.
You know, there are some films and dramas out there that they're not billed as Christian stories or plays, but they have strong biblical themes.
Yeah.
You might even say they have godly messages, even though the people that write them and produce them, they're not thinking along those lines. You know, one example I can think of is Beauty and the Beast.
Yeah.
And then there's Shrek.
Shrek. Yeah.
Tell me about Shrek.
You don't think there's anything that's really redemptive, but if you analyze the story of Shrek,
Yeah.
there's huge sense of theology woven into the deeper layer of that story. Of course, you know, an ogre and a donkey and that sort of stuff, there's nothing theological about that per se, but if you analyze the underlying story, here's a character who's wanting to stay away from society.
Yes.
That's his life.
Yes.
He's got inner wound, and he has an opportunity to move forward and do something redemptive.
Yes.
He doesn't really want to, but he's going to, because he wants to get rid of the people in his swamp. And he has a chance along the way to change.
Yes.
And he begins to take the journey away from that prior identity.
Yes.
And he goes through a death and resurrection process himself
Yes.
to get rid of that old identity and step into a new identity.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's a process that resonates a lot with
Yeah.
who we are as we go through our wounds and moving from one identity into a new
Yeah.
identity that's got more wholeness and more healing.
Yeah. And to watch him go through that transformation is a very touching thing, even though it's a cartoon. What's his girlfriend's name?
Fiona.
Fiona?
Fiona,
Okay, yeah, you're better at that. But the message there that I was hearing was, wow, this gal's outward appearance was not the big deal.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I was blown away by the message at the end there.
Great messages.
Great message.
Yeah,
there
you don't
about
have to be...
authentic beauty.
Yes, it is on the inside.
Yeah.
And she's under a curse and she's released from that.
Yeah, yeah.
There's some amazing things there.
Yeah. Well, let me go back to Darrell Miller here just for a minute, Mark. He says this. He says, for art, and I think he would include drama in this statement, for art to have any value in many evangelical circles, it must deal overtly and unambiguously with spiritual or religious themes. It may also be justified if it is employed in worship or evangelism. Now, apart from this, he says, there is little space for the Christian artist to be an artist. What do you think of that?
Unfortunately, yeah, I would agree with that, generally.
Mm-hmm.
I think there are some places, some churches that see, hey, this is a great opportunity for believers to activate their faith in what we call the entertainment industry, whether it's on stage or in film.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's a number of reasons for that. There's been a lot of abuse. There's been a lot of terrible morality expressed in the entertainment industry.
Yes.
But I think that's a great opportunity for believers to step in and to write powerful stories and to direct and produce stories and to act in those kind of presentations. It's
to redeem
it,
the arts.
And to let their light shine in a very, very dark place.
Yeah.
We need, I think it's great to see the entertainment stage film as a way that it's, in some forms, it's a mission field.
Yes.
To be able to step in there and be, if you will, cross-cultural.
Yes.
And participate without getting too dirty, if I can use that expression, in a way that will help bring great messages, incarnate God's love, truth in those worlds.
Yeah. You know, there's a lot of time and effort involved in doing a drama at a Christian school. What justifies drama for a school program? Why? What's the payback here? What's the value in it?
Let's face it, not every student who's on stage is going to have a career in drama.
Right.
But nearly all of us have a chance in our lives somewhere to stand up in front of an audience and speak.
Yes.
And it's one of the most terrifying things that most people do.
Yes.
But if you have had some experience on stage in a drama, you've gained that skill and you have the confidence, okay, I can do this without falling apart entirely.
Yeah.
So that's one thing.
Confidence builder.
Confidence. There's a whole lot of activity that's invisible. It's never seen on stage, but if the lights don't work, if the audio doesn't work, people are taken out of the story, and you learn, wow, there's a lot that goes into producing an event, a presentation, and there's a lot of skill there that's really important.
Yes.
So those jobs are good to do. And I think what I'm trying to do is integrate the stories that we present here with other parts of the curriculum in the school.
Oh, tell us more about that.
Well, obviously, in your English department, you study Shakespeare.
Mm-hmm.
Well, of course, you could do Romeo and Juliet.
Mm-hmm.
We were talking today about A Tale of Two Cities.
Mm-hmm.
Who is the hero? If you know that story, it's a little bit tricky. And so if you put it on stage, it begins to help the literature department, the English students, begin to grapple with some of those issues. And would I be willing to lay down my life that way?
Mm-hmm.
So I think there's an integrative sense to drama.
Yes.
It's not just an after-school thing.
Yes.
It's something that the whole school can participate in and learn from, as well as another dimension is inviting the community in to cheer on the students or else to participate and realize, hey, this is a great community. It's more than just a school.
Yes.
It's a community where we all can connect with each other.
Yes. Do you have any cautionary words for those who are listening?
Well, sure. It's easy to get wound up in huge budgets with lots of equipment and lots of costumes, things like that. But it can be done inexpensively. It takes more creativity. Choosing good plays, good musicals is important. But more than cautions, I've got huge encouragements just to be involved, to let drama be a part of the school, the classroom, even family activities, churches. It's a great way to put truth into real life and to express things that couldn't always be expressed through a sermon.
Yes.
Or through a Sunday school class, or through just talking one-on-one.
Yes. Well, Mark, you're directing an all-school production, but some of the teachers watching this may be classroom teachers that could incorporate some dramatic elements into their classroom curriculum. One of the things I've been sharing with those that are watching this is the story of Comenius. And not only was he the first educator to write a book with illustrations, but he also incorporated drama into learning. I think he was light years ahead of his time, you know. But drama isn't something that necessarily has to be done on a stage, in a theater with lights and costumes, but it can be incorporated very simply at a classroom level.
And powerfully.
Yeah, tell us more about that.
One of the easiest things to do in a classroom is what's called reader's theater. You don't memorize any of the lines. You just have selected participants come up, usually sit in a row, and their roles are outlined, and they just read the script. Somewhat in character, maybe rehearse it once or twice even, and somehow there's magic that happens when people just do simple reader's theater. It could be a short 5-minute presentation. You could do a section from Shakespeare. Anything like that brings those elements to life. And it can be done also with biblical stories. I've even heard of people that have found new life in Bible reading just by having one or two people, maybe more, read the Bible passage somewhat in character. You might need a narrator, and then you have somebody who's Moses.
Role-playing.
Yeah, a little role-play. And of course, if you're wanting to teach values, it's great to have actually role-play between two students who are fighting, and what's a better way to resolve conflict. Or role-play on a script or a little sketch that you can find on the internet. There's lots of them out there that makes the point you're trying to get across in your classroom or your church, things like that. Yeah, lots of stuff that can be done.
Lots of stuff. You know, as we're talking, I can't help but think of a documentary I saw a few years ago. I don't know if you've seen it, but it's called The Hobart Shakespeareans. Have you seen that?
That's powerful stuff.
Powerful. I've seen the movie probably 3 or 4 times. It's worth watching several times.
The Hobart Shakespeareans. Look it up.
Well, Mark, it's been a real pleasure to talk with you, and thank you for taking time. And I believe that what you said here will help a lot of people.
Hope so.
God bless you, man.
Thank you.
Yeah.